organization. We began this thing, of course, 6 years ago, not knowing what to do or how to do or where to go. And these kind of things are telling us that we are going in the right direction, and that we are saving and preserving and disseminating information about Lowell area past and history, and it will get better and better. But so far, we're doing okay. I will introduce the panel to you. Very distinguished citizens of our community for many years. King Doyle, President and Chief Operator of the King Milling Company, of course. Betty Geiter. Was your maiden name Roth? Yes, Betty Roth Geiter. For a long time school teacher in our area, and knows everything and everyone that has happened around here. Jack Lally, longtime resident of Lowell. His family was here for many, many years long ago, and many of them have disappeared, I think, a little bit. You're in Ionia now, are you, Jack?
Yes.
Yes, Jack's in Ionia. Let's see, there's the very far north of town, where they raise different lallies. Shirttail. Yeah, okay. Helen Donahue, is that Donahue McMahon? Yeah. Met some handsome fellow named Bert McMahon someplace along the line, and he captured her, brought her to Lowell, I think. Where were you from initially? Mount Pleasant. Yeah. We're very fortunate to have Helen. Here comes Betty. Any late penalty point for Charlie for being late or tardy? Stand in the corner for stand after school.
I got a good excuse, teacher.
Yes, Charlie. We're waiting, Charlie. What's your good excuse? Oh, yeah. The best excuse I ever heard was one of my classmates was Howard Rittinger, and Howard the class started at 9 o'clock in the morning, and Howard showed up at 10 o'clock. And this is a long time ago. Howard had been standing on safety patrol down at Weaver's Corner, where the groceries meat market was. Well, years ago, electric clocks were new in the community, and the power had gone off for an hour during the night, and Howard was off for an hour and never came back on. So his electric clock got him up an hour late. He dutifully went down, stood on safety patrol for a period of time, came last hour late. Well, anyway, let's get on with this. I think we'll pretty much do it just as we did last time. Last time we had a whole wonderful, nice list of questions, and I think we got through question 1. But we'll do it the same way. I didn't introduce Charlie Doyle. Yeah. Anyone here that doesn't know Charlie Doyle? Yeah. Oh, that's Charlie Doyle. Former postmaster, former automobile salesman, but retired from everything now. And now all he does is attend conventions. He does this way. Well, let's start with you then, Charlie. Have you got the list of questions, by the way?
No.
You don't.
I have now.
You have now. Here's one for King. I'll tell you what our plan is here. It's we're going to try to answer the first 3 questions, which are for those not born in Lowell. What brought you to Lowell and when? What was your first impression of Lowell, and what was your first job in Lowell? So, anyway, begin, Charlie.
Okay, well, I'll tell you, I remember my first dollar I earned in Lowell, and it came from Art Curtis Sr. And that was taking handbells around when he had the Fort Agency down here on the corner of Main and Hudson. And he, I can't, it was back in 30. I can't remember the date, but he said that my brother was selling cars for him. I know that, and he needed somebody to take handbills around the house. And I did that, and I can remember going in there and him giving me the dollar, and I can remember that first dollar. Another part of that story I should tell too. Dick Curtis, who just passed away, was working, he was pumping gas for his dad at the gas station. And I just got that dollar First thing Dick did is say, "Hey, Joy, let me borrow that dollar." I'll never forget that. Well, he didn't get that dollar. If I went right down here, you know, there's so many memories I got of Lowell. You know, one thing that really sticks in my memory is the lunacy we used to have down in Recreation Park. We used to have them on Saturday night. And maybe I'd have 2 or 3 cents or a nickel. If I had a nickel to spend, that was a lot of money in those days. Maybe it doesn't sound like it was, but it was. You could go to Earl Cole, who had the candy store, and he would have a punch, just like a punch board is today, and you could punch out. You always won 1, but you might hit 20, and you get 20 jawbreakers instead of 1 on this punch board for a penny. And if you got 20, that lasted you a long time. I'll remember Earl Cole. He had all that penny candy in there, and you know how kids go in and stand and look and look and look. And at that time, Earl didn't have he never had a soda bar. Chris had a soda bar that I remember. And in fact, another fond memory is Chris's drive-in, where the Rite Aid now is. That was a drive-in for malts and sodas and sundaes, things like that. And they had quite a dairy bar. I think you could see probably 60 people in there on a big counter. And I can remember the people that worked there. And, you know, this was 60 years ago. Over 60 years ago. Favorite spot? Well, I worked at the Shell station for Budmore. Now, a lot of people don't know Budmore. He had the Shell station, and I pumped gas for Bud down there during the war. And it was kind of a hangout, which kids, I feel sorry for the kids today that don't have a place to hang out. When you're growing up, you're a teenager, you need some place to go. I think most kids do, and that was the place where we always went. After we took our dates home, we'd end up there and have a hamburger, something, and it was I remember, well, it was only a couple blocks from where I used to live, and I could get home before midnight, so I had a little curfew that we could hold in time. Remember the fires? I remember that Sunday morning when they said, you know, all the kids always wish when you're in school that the school would burn down. Yeah, we got school burned down, you know, then we wouldn't have to go. That was the worst thing that could ever happen to me, because I was taking chemistry. And I'll tell you, if you can't do any lab work, you aren't going to get chemistry too well. And if you went on to college and you took chemistry in college and haven't done any lab work, I'll tell you, it's pretty hard, pretty tough. And I'll tell you, that's 2 years. We finally, in physics, got into the school where we did get some lab work in physics. But there was none. There was no lab work the whole year for chemistry. Swaber would do all the lab experiments at the desk up front. And I remember this one time he had that, I can't even remember the metal that just shoots out. I mean, it goes out, when it hits the air, it just went all over. And he poured some on the floor. And I can remember that just shooting all over. He was kind of a crazy guy anyway. He'd get somebody sitting in class, and he'd be sound asleep, and he'd fill a thing full of water, and he'd get him right in the face. Charlie, I'm trying to get down to the end.
No, Charlie. You were late. This is what the penalty for being late. We only wanted you to answer the first 3 questions, Charlie, but go stand in the corner again. So anyway, we're going to come back to some of those, Charlie, if we get it all done with everybody else. But anyway, I didn't explain the clock. This is my method of stuffing a sack in his mouth once in a while. Charlie, I can do it. Nobody else I could. But, so anyway, we'll move on to King and give us answers to your first 3 questions there, King.
The first 3 I can't answer because I was raised all my life in Lowell.
Yeah.
Jack Lally's brother and I graduated together, class of 1940. We had our 55th class reunion. Oh.
Couldn't you hear
you out this?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, Jack's brother and I graduated together in the class of 1940. We had our 55th class reunion a week ago out here at Deer Run. And we had actually a total of 50 people showed up, and 2 of our teachers came, which I think is quite remarkable. Bruce Walter came and his wife, and then a Miss Nicewanger. Now, I don't know, do any of you remember Miss Nicewanger? She was our, Ruby does, she was our commercial teacher, I think. And we dedicated our annual to her. But the thing that is interesting, and I think you'll get a kick out of it, is Bill Lally brought me a picture of the Old West Ward School and the graduating class. And of course, I went 4 years to the Old West Ward School. Now, most of you probably know where it was. It's right where Newell's factory is today. But it was a 2-story building, and it was quite old, 50, 60 years ago. And the first floor was fine. The second floor had a lot of cracks in it and knots, and you could actually look down through the knots and see down below. Well, Miss Bushnell taught first and second grade, and I had Miss Bushnell for the first and second grade. Then we graduated to the third and fourth, and Miss Perry taught the third and fourth. Well, I don't know whether any of you remember Bertha Holland or not, but at our reunion, some of the people remembered Bertha Holland. Well, Bertha and I were in the same grade, but we were either in the third or fourth grade, and Bertha raised her hand, but Miss Perry said no. Well, Bertha, God love her, she's dead now, but Bertha had to go, and she did. But the poorest person down on the now that's the gospel true story. And we had Dorothy Scott at our reunion, and she verified it. So that was very humorous. Our class of 1940 has the dubious honor of having more killed in combat than any other class. And we had 77. 25 years ago, we had our 25th, 30 years ago, we had our 25th. We had 37 show up then. But here, 55 years after we graduated, we had 27 classmates show up. And then we had spouses and all. We got a total of 50, which I think is quite great for a class 55 years ago. Now, I'm not quite as long-winded as my cousin. Memories of school, I think my West Ward school was really interesting. It was in those formidable years, and I do love, cherish my thoughts of Miss Perry. She was a great teacher. And of course, the city gave it to Frank Newell. Frank Newell had it as his factory. He made that gun and shot the ping pong ball there. And then later, he expanded. But I think for some tax reason or some other reason, you had to keep part of the old building there. So he just knocked the top floor down. And inside the Newell factory today are the walls and the foundation of the old West Ward School. They're still there. Well, famous people or authors, I can remember Glendon Swartout came, this is after the war, and wanted to talk to us and get some history about Lowell. So we went over to that famous high-class restaurant called Curly's. And we sat there for about an hour or so and brought him up with the knowledge that we had. And then he went back and later wrote Welcome to Thieves. We do have an autographed book that he wrote to us. So that's a pleasant memory for me. And now before the bell rings, I turn it over to Betty.
Well done, King. That was very, very good. Before we continue, I'm going to introduce Phil Snyder. He has to go stand in the corner for Betty, or stay after school? Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, both. All right. And I don't want Phil to miss, so Phil, what we're going to ask you to try and do is answer the first 3 questions. When it's your turn to speak, and then we'll go back and start again. And Charlie, and he'll Phil is at the floor, but if I have to, I will ring the bell on you. Well, anyway, Betty Rothsnyder will give us some of her recollection.
Well, I wasn't born in Lowell. I was born far south here in Clarksville, Michigan. You heard that? I was born the daughter of a farmer. My mom and dad lived on a farm there. The question is, what brought you to Lowell? I remember coming to Lowell every week. My mom brought her eggs into the Foreman hatchery. And Mr. Foreman was very often there, so I learned to dearly love him. But that was a great day to bring those eggs into town. Then my mom saved that money. She had a little kitty in which she put that money, and I remember she put in a bathroom, an inside bathroom with that egg money that she had. I'll never forget that. I guess I won't forget it because we always had to go outside to the bathroom. In this little house outside, and I always ran out and ran back. And I remember this one time saying, I am not going to run, I'm going to walk both ways. Well, my dad had his cows pastured out right by the field, which was right by the little house, and as I was walking towards the house, all of a sudden this cow moved and scared me half to death. I never walked after that. My first impression of Lowell. This might not sound very good in today's time, but back then, those were great days. Mom and Dad used to bring us into Lowell every Saturday night with 5 cents in our pocket. And we would go to Christensen's and buy a big ice cream cone, and then we'd walk up and down the street, back and forth, back and forth. And that was just a great day in our life, was to come into town on Saturday nights, and walk the streets. And you don't walk the streets today. My first job was teaching. In fact, I graduated in 1940 also from Clarksville, class of 15. And my first job was teaching in a country school. I taught at big wages. In fact, I went out at big wages, $900 a year. My dad gave me a car, so I had a nice car to drive back and forth. I even painted it myself. I think I paid $1 and some for the paint. And it was a big Pontiac, and I liked the car. Painted it this lovely gray and drove back and forth to my country school, which was south of Alto, known as Lowell School, and I taught there 2 years. I had a box social because it was wartime. And Mr. Runciman came out to auction off my boxes for the box social. And a week or so later, he came out to visit me again, and I remember him walking around the room with his pennies jingling in his pocket. And before he left, he said, I'd like to have you come into my office someday and see about teaching in Lowell next year. So I taught 2 years in the country school and then came into Lowell and taught 32 years here in the Lowell system. I taught off and on. I retired, I think, 3 or 4 times. I like retirements because they give you parties. And, so I quit 3 or 4 different times, had my children, and then went back into teaching because there was no one else available at that time in wartime. So I was in and out all of the time. Enjoyed myself very much as a teacher in the Lowell schools. I saw a lot of things happen. The building burned down. We taught in the Methodist school for a while. And those were the days when we did what they call today team teaching. I remember teaching music to the 3rd and 4th grades. Can't sing a bit, but I taught the music. And some of you people out in the audience, I had as students, great kids. There's Fred Bradford. He was one of my naughty ones. So anyway.
Just once in a while.
Well, thank you very much, Betty. Let me ask you just, were you teaching when the school burned?
Yes.
That was, as Charlie said, I was, of course, a student at the time.
That's the first time.
And it was a very traumatic thing for the children, I know. Was it as traumatic or worse for the teachers?
Oh, it was terrible. We had to teach in the Methodist church gym, and you heard what all of the other teachers were doing. It was hectic.
It was a awful mess. Well, thank you very much, Betty. Next is Jack Lally. Anxious to hear your impressions, Jack.
Thank you, Norm. Of course, I'm kind of an outsider. This is my first time that I've ever attended any of your meetings, and it won't be the last. It's just unfortunate that Ionia doesn't have this active a group. They have a historical society, and we have a beautiful home, if you folks are familiar with it. But I just think that as far as participation, it falls on the shoulders of just a few people. In order to kind of follow your format here, I kind of have lost. I say first job, the impression of Lowell, so I'm being born in Lowell. I can't tell you how I personally feel that. I think that any of you folks who go back to your roots and so on, these are as long as you get older, these are the memories that you cherish the most. And it's an amazing thing. Whether or not Charlie Dawg comes to Ionia and he says, "You remember who has the highest monument in the cemetery in Ionia?" You know, these questions, you know, he's always testing my ability. But it's just the idea that we grow up, we have these dear friends, we leave them, and years later, as you get older, take it from me, as you get older, they come back, you think about them, you're more interested in hearing about them, what they're doing, and so on. And I think this is true in my case here. When Charlie said, "Why don't you come to Lowell?" I said, "What would I have to offer?" It's just the idea that I just would enjoy coming back. Not to take too much of your time, I don't want that clock to run off. But the first job, I think all of you, just looking at age, some of you qualify as senior citizens. At age, if we go back to a date in 1927, 28, 29, my first job, and there weren't many jobs then, Lizzie Lally bought some raw peanuts, and she would cook them, and she'd bag them. And I took these raw peanuts in bags and went around the neighborhood and sold them. I sold them to even John Earhart. I sold them to Monica and Bill Doyle. I sold them to R.M. Shibble, Bert Shibble. I sold them to the sprayer. I sold them to the Cooper shop. How many people here know where the Cooper shop is? Do you really? That's the test, because that Cooper shop, that separates the men and the boys. If you know where that is, you're a lowlife. But up and down Main Street, the sprayer, the various stores and so on, I could to this day tell you every single customer how many bags of peanuts at 5 cents or 10 cents a bag they would buy. And truly, if my brother Bob or my sister or my mother were here, they would all verify the fact that, thank God we had those peanuts, because those were the tough times. And some of you folks can remember those. There were no jobs. There was no money. And say for these good friends of ours in the city of Lowell, or the friends in Lowell, we managed to get by. Other than that, it's a favorite spot, favorite teachers, favorite something. When you grow up in this town with so many wonderful people, I had, for example, a man by the name of Ronald Finch, who I just adored. High school, I had him in college, and so on. Ron Finch, as far as any outstanding teachers, I think that anyone who worked under him would certainly verify that Ron was one of the greatest. And then we had some other great teachers that had strong impression on us. But I think the one that probably through all of the years, the one that impressed me the most was, I would have to say, would be Ron Finch. I do thank you so much for letting me speak and inviting me back here, and I hope that this won't be my last trip here. I think the only reason they sent the thing, I noticed on there was a membership join. I think that's the only reason they made a trip to Ionia to get me. Helen McMahon done.
Thank you, Jack. One question, how do we find out where the Cooper shop was? Are you going to reveal? Oh, you're not going to tell? Just us. I don't know where it was. Where was it?
Main Street along the river. The city's got their cable TV right now.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sure. You don't have to stand. Standing is not required, Ellen. That's all. Yep.
Well, I think I've answered the first question too. I came here in the fall of 1931.
Ellen, put it on the changer. Right up the month.
In the fall of 1931, after 3 years of college, not yet 21 years old, I came to Lowell to teach home economics in the junior high and the high school. And I had the 45-minute periods, I can't remember, I was busy all the time. Also, I had to put on the cafeteria at school during the lunch hour, so I didn't have a lunch hour. But I had a class called cafeteria class with about 6 girls who fixed things such as macaroni and cheese or beef stew or Spanish rice or something, which sold in the cafeteria for either 2 or 3 cents a serving. Those are my chief memories. I taught 3 years before I married Burning Man. And my favorite spot was his Chrysler Roadster. I've been probing my memory this week, trying to think of some things that happened during young. And I do remember things that happened in Lowell, but not necessarily history. We had 4 children, and our 2 boys were the younger of the 2. And when Buzz, the older one, was 4, he was invited to a birthday party in the neighborhood at Gary Croft's 4th birthday party, Bernard and Betty's son. And so I parted his hair neatly and gave him his package to take and said, be sure when you leave to tell Mrs. Croft that you had a nice time. When he came back, he said, yes, he'd had a good time. And did you tell Mrs. Croft that? Yes, I was afraid I'd forget it, so I told her as soon as I got there. 3 or 4 years after that, when Pat was in kindergarten, he was a friend of Scott Jeffries, whose father owned the Ledger. His mother was ill at the time, and Harold had hired a woman to stay with the children in the afternoon, but she was older, and I think she liked to take naps. So Scott was at our house a lot and played. One day he came in, and there was a gift on the dining room table wrapped. I was in the kitchen, and I heard Scott say, Pat, who's that for? Pat said, it's for Libby Collier. She's having a birthday party. Scott says, I'm going too. Pat says, you are? Where's your present? He says, I haven't got one. I'm getting it free. And the third thing that occurs to me has nothing to do with me, but Parnell. And Laurie Shepard tells this story, but it's about her aunt and uncle who owned the store at that time. And they lived upstairs, and one would be upstairs resting while the other was minding the store. It was during the Depression, and it was hard to meet those bills. So one day when Aunt Annie was down there, a man came and he wanted to collect for the sugar. Annie went to the the door and called upstairs, John, the sugar man's here. He says, okay, but he didn't come down. Before he even got down, man came to collect for the meat. She went desperate. He said, John, the meat man's here too. He said, well, word him off, get rid of it. She said, I would, but I can't think whether to meet the sugar man or sugar the meat man. Those things stay neighbors, still neighbors, Bruce Walter and Anita, and after all these years. Enjoyed your bit of salad tonight. I remember the fires, no floods, showboat of course. Oh, that's all.
That's well done, Ellen. Clap, too. Helen, what was Laurie Shepard's maiden name?
Heffron.
Heffron. Oh, yeah, lots of Heffrons from Marnell. Terrific. Thanks very much. Next is my friend and pal, long time associate. Here.
Of course, I'm like Betty. I was not born in Lowell. I was born outside of Lowell. I don't even know exactly where. Dr. Gutlerson brought me into this world. I remember that. I'm like mucking coat. That was 1928, same year that Charlie came into the world. I wish I'd have been here when Charlie talked because I might have been able to question some of the things he said. Now he'll be able to question me. Oh, okay. Anyway, probably my first impression of Lowell, having lived in the country and not even having electric lights, which I don't know whether Betty had those or not. We also had one of those buildings out back. Probably my first impression of Lowell was electric lights. I came in at night and saw them on Main Street. Uh, Other than that, really, my memory of coming in and out of Lowell is like Betty, probably the Saturday nights, living on a farm, and all the people that stayed till, well, stores closed, and then they stayed till after that, so it had to be after 9 o'clock, and just visited. Cars would be parked. Some people, even at that time, were still driving wagons, teams of horses, in my recollection anyway. My first job, everybody probably here knew Forrest Buck. And if they remember the A&P store, Forrest Buck gave me my first job when I came into high school, sweeping floors at the A&P store, which was the Borgeson building, if I'm not mistaken, right, Norm? Yeah. That was my very first job. I held a lot of other jobs after that, of course, and the biggest job probably here in town as a young man was working for a foreman who had the chicken hatchery. And really that's about, getting to that point, that's about all I have to offer right now.
Well done.
Well done, Phil. That's, now we'll go back to, I probably forgot to tell you that after we do this for an hour or so, then did I tell you that we want you to ask questions or share your memories or thoughts or anything that you have to say? We want to hear from the audience also. But for a while yet, we're going to have the panel dominate this thing. Charlie, did you get back to your list here? Have you got any other things you want to fill in on here?
Well, we've got famous people from here.
Yes.
You know, here's something I've been working on. I don't know how many people are familiar with Lowell. There was a plane built, and it flew quite regularly. In fact, I don't know if you remember the article I put in the Ledger. I tried to get the Grand Rapids Press, and they said it's not newsworthy enough. Well, all I wanted to do is try to track down the people that were instrumental in forming this company. And they made the McCarthy Air Scout. It was a two-place cabin commercial plane with an Zenny engine in it. Now it says this plane is first airplane manufactured by this company is called the Air Scout in semi-Canada. Locally were cabin type two-place monoplane. It was successfully test flown by C.D. Swinson, former Army pursuit pilot, on January 15, 1925, and for 5 months during the fall and winter of 1925-26, the plane was continuously flown under the most adverse conditions without alteration or an adjustment of any description. Later, they took the plane to below the Grand Rapids and blew a cylinder out, and that was the end of the plane. I can't, I've tried to research this. I've gone to the library. I've gone to Kent County International Airport, their historical branch. I can't find a thing on it because this man in California, he's the one that was going to write an article on this. However, I did find some people in Lowell that were instrumental in seeing this plane. And it was Elmer Lawyer saw it, Robin Maloney saw it when they were kids. It was built in a building right down on Hudson and Main Street, right in that corner where there isn't anything there now. In a building that they built this airplane, and they housed it too. But other than that, I just read from the Aviation Magazine. It's a February 7th issue, 1927. Now, if anybody would like to take a look at this, or they're aviation minded, feel free to look at it. Because this man in California, he's the one that wanted to research the plane and write an article on it and things like that. In fact, he did make a model of this McCarthy Air Scout, and he had it in a construction. He had it in a telling you how to do it. His name was Sherman Gillespie. I talked with him numerous times on the phone, corresponded through the mail. I have a questionnaire I've sent out to other people, but I never got it back. There were certain individuals, Harold H. Cornelius, President, George L. McCarthy, Vice President, and Wilbur T. Davis, Secretary of Treasury. Now, these people had to be located in Grand Rapids, but my research came up with nothing. Anything else?
Charlie, briefly, what do you see as perhaps a biggest change in the area?
Well, I think it's the expansion. Huh? It's really expanding. I mean, it's going this way, it's going that way, and it's also going always. You know, I mean, you can't go in on any road outside of town where you don't see new homes going on. So it's expanding all over.
Well, thank you very much, Charlie. I'm not a member of the panel. I'm going to tell a story on Charlie.
Oh, no.
Don't tell that story.
Everybody heard it. WPA story?
No. Oh, yeah, I guess maybe it's the sewers. When I was Charlie about 5 years old, we lived in the same neighborhood, back right across the back fence from each other, and Charlie and some of his cutthroat friends like Walt Croft and Rodney Croft, Charlie Croft, Rex Brown, stuff like that. Well, they were building all these new sewers in town. I was just a little kid. Charlie was a big kid. He was 5 years. I was 5, and he was 10. So they thought it'd be great fun to take Norman and put him down in one of these sewers and leave him there, which they did. They were brand new, wonderful sewers. They put me down in the sewer, put the top back on, and left me there. I howled and screamed for a long time, and finally somebody heard me coming out of there. That's the kind of guy Charlie used to be.
Well, I got something to ask you. Who's got the biggest tombstone in the cemetery? I've already given that out. Oh, you have? Yes. Who had the last racehorse in all? I asked Ray McCartney that the other night. Is that right? I guess. You know who had the last racehorse in all?
I think you're wrong on that. I hate that question. Now you're sorry. I think you said you said Fennell, Bernardsville.
I think it's no. What?
That's your post office.
Yeah, but I know he had one after.
Sold out of that place.
Oh, he had one a lot later.
Later.
No, he's the last.
Oh, the last.
That's on my lot.
Well, that's true, you know, that's probably, a lot of people may not remember that there was a track down around the recreation park area where horses did race. There was, that whole fairground area was surrounded by a half, I think it was a half mile.
That's dirt track in the state of Michigan right down there. That's dirt track.
Now it's grass. Well, thank you, Charlie. Now we'll move on to King and hear some other answers to these thoughtful questions that we have posed to King. Anything that you can dig up, such as what do you think the biggest change in the whole area might be?
Well, I agree with Charlie. The expansion is fantastic. There's no question about it. And the traffic down Main Street and Hudson Street is almost as bad as Main Street. Whenever we get down there, you can't make a left-hand turn on Hudson or on Main Street anymore. You got to make a right and then go around the block to do it. And I think I've told you about everything I get out. I'm going to pass on to Betty.
That's fine. Okay, Betty, did you move on down the list here? You got A on your first three questions. Now let's see if you go for another A.
I would say my favorite memory, having lived here now as long as I have, is the people of Lowell. I'm a member of Women's Club now, and I have never noted before how much talent and how wonderful the people of Lowell are. My husband always said, we live in Lowell, we will shop in Lowell. So if there was any shopping that could be done in Lowell, that's where we had to do it. He was very loyal to Lowell, and I can see why, because Lowell does have a lot of people with a lot of talent, and they always remember you. My favorite spot was Christensen's drugstore. We went every noon and had a sandwich and an ice cream sundae. And Ruby was usually there to serve us. We teachers went together for our lunch at noon. Some of my favorite people, naturally, were some of the teachers with whom I taught. Ann Borgeson was one. I'll never forget a story that she told me. She was telling me, well, I have this brother, George, and then she said, then I have two brothers that I don't talk about. And if you know Ann, Ann is very, you just believe everything she says. So I believed the story for a long time. I thought, I wonder who these two brothers are and what they did that she doesn't want to talk about. Well, I finally found out. Another very dear friend was Mr. Gumser. I taught for him for quite a few years. I never really knew Mr. Finch or old Phil Snyder, that would be Phil's dad. I knew old Phil, but I didn't know Ron Finch. But my husband talked so much about Ron Finch. He must have been a wonderful man because he talked a lot about him. And my husband also had a great deal of love for old Phil. That would be your dad. And some of the memories, I don't remember much about the fire, but I do remember the flood. My mother lived on, Mom and Dad lived on Grove Street when they retired from farming, and they had water way up in their basement. That's the only time that I ever remember the water coming that high, but their basement was flooded at that time. I did attend some of the showboats. I don't remember any special act, but I did enjoy the Endmen. I thought they were absolutely hilarious. Some of the memories of, another memory that I have. This goes way, way back. When we brought our eggs into town, I remember we went into the drugstore at that time, and I looked across the street, and upstairs, that would be probably above Hill's shoe store, I saw a lady crying in the window, and I said to my mom, I wonder what she's crying about. And Mom said, well, that's the lawyer's office up there. She probably has to go to jail or did something wrong, and that's why she's crying out. For some reason or other, that has always stuck in my mind. I can still see her to this day crying there. We mentioned some famous people, but I have some others that I'd like to mention. Peter McPherson, for one, president of Michigan State University. I had him in school, and I had most of the other McPherson children. I was very proud of what he said not too long ago. He was asked by a reporter, why don't you speak up on some of the views that you have concerning politics and so on? His remark was, I do have very strong views on many of these issues that are pertinent today, but he said, I wasn't hired to do that. I am president of Michigan State, and my only thought is to do what is best for Michigan State. And I thought that was a very proud answer, and felt that I was glad that I knew him and had him in school. As far as the biggest change is concerned, it's traffic. I live out by the blinker light, and in the morning and later in the evening, there's no way you can cross the street. The traffic is so heavy. And about every other hour, there's an accident at our corner. Some people don't seem to understand what red is for or what orange is for or whatever. However, I will say that I think the engineering on that road was not very good. But Lowell is developing, getting much, much bigger. We used to think of Lowell as being a little rural community. It's no longer rural. We are all urban now. And I guess that's all I have to say. Thank you.
That's terrific. Thank you very much, Betty. Jack, how about you? Do you have any additional comments?
I don't have too much to add to that, other than the fact that you say this is a little town. But we were big town back. I really mean big town back a few years ago, in which Charlie Knapp was our only motorcycle policeman. In the bank in Grand Rapids, and Charlie, you can tell me, which was that Union Bank or Winter King? Do you remember which bank in Grand Rapids was robbed? Anyway, this was the time of the radio, and it came over the radio that this bank had been robbed. And the Purple Gang, his was heading on M21 towards Lowell. And everyone who had a radio had it on. And everyone at Lowell was ready. Frank McMahon, Charlie Doyle, you name it. And they had Charlie Knapp wound up like a two-bed pond. And this car came right straight through Main Street. And it was the Berkeley gang. And Charlie attempted to pull him over on his motorcycle. And they leaned out with the gun and shot Charlie right off his motorcycle. And there's still bullets. Dr. White used to have an office, a dentist. And there's bullets in that building where these guys were using this machine gun trying to kill Charlie off. This was the highlight. This was big time. We weren't small time. There wasn't anything in Chicago, but there wasn't anything in New York bigger than this. We had it. We had every newspaper in the country. I think that year that month we had Life magazine or Time.
Life.
Oh, Charlie corrected me. The light wasn't out yet. There's always a historian there, no matter where you go, you know. But this has been very enjoyable. Ellen, give them a little more.
Well, to add to Jack's story, a vigilante group, of course, was formed, and they set out and they captured these guys. And up north of town, someplace up in the Greenville area, I think they caught them all, and they didn't recover the money, I guess, but most of them went to jail for considerable periods of time for murder. Thank you very much, Jack. Ellen, do you have any additional thoughts here you want to share with us?
I remember the Charlie Knapp incident. It was during the lunch hour, and I was in the Yellow Roadster and teaching stuff. But the people who killed Charlie almost ran Vernon down.
Ran
Almost Vernon was driving the car.
Oh, was it?
15 minutes. But they almost ran into our car. They were trying to get away from it.
Yes.
Of course, we knew Mabel well, too, Charlie's wife. Two memorable people that I think haven't been mentioned here. One is an ex-student of mine, Edna Swardow, who achieved quite a bit of fame as an author and filmmaker. And the other one is dear Father Edward Jewell. I don't know if anybody here remembers him, but he was an individual, if ever there was one. He was pastor of St. Mary's Church here, but he had been an Episcopalian minister and married and had 3 children before his wife died. He converted to Catholicism, and he came here with his daughter, who became a good friend of mine, who had never married and who supposedly kept house. Jack lived next door, you may know how she kept it. But they were very dear people. And Father Jewell has a nephew, a grandson. His son married and had sons. And one of those sons came to Lowell, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago. Since you were married, he came because you and Marie took him to dinner. But they came to my house that evening, and I think his name was Dick Jewell.
Dixon.
Grandson. And me. Joe. Anyway, he came with his wife and 2 daughters. Anyway, and he wanted to know incidents that had happened when Father Jewell was in town because he was an unusual man. He was very tall and lanky and kind. He had a little tiny dog that he carried, went with him every place on a leash. And he was a very tolerant man, having not strict views about religion, but just Christian in every respect. So I told his grandson the stories that I knew about him because the grandson said he was going to write a book about him. And he asked me if I would write him a letter and tell him anything I could remember. I wrote a 12-page letter to that man, and I never heard from him again or saw the book on the market. He did take after his grandfather, that's for sure.
Thank you very much, Helen. I just vaguely remember Father Jewell, but one Catholic memory I have, I'm some reason I was down at Storm's garage when I was on the bridge down there. And in those days, the nuns wore their habits. The nuns came to the garage or something. And then they scared me to death. I thought they were ghosts. To this day, I can remember the terror that I felt seeing those nuns in their habits. Being pretty frightened of them. Bill, how about you? Do you have any additional comments you want to share with us?
The next item is memories, and of course, my favorite memories are coming into Lowell to school, and then eventually moving into Lowell, living on Avery Street, which gets me to a favorite spot where you, Norm, and my brother, and seems like there was a Bresnaw kid, and they bugged the hell out of me. They tried to burn the house down in the basement one time. They had a meeting down there. Those are memories that I remember. Favorite people, probably my favorite person, most of all in high school anyway, was Chris Birch. I don't think that anyone ever impressed me more than Chris as a young man. Another one was Charlie White. Charlie White took Charlie, Noel, myself, and numerous other young men on many excursions to the big city that we've never visited before. At least I had never visited, and showed us around and got us going to what's all about in this world. Another memory that Betty brought up about my father and her husband was my father and his boxing. Betty, you probably don't remember that, do you? Or do you know? My father, as a younger man, boxed quite a bit. And he tried to get all these young farm kids like Don and some of the reserve boys interested in boxing, and in fact did. However, I think most of them got smart and quit that real early. They didn't go much farther. Really, that's about all I have right now, Norm.
Those are terrific memories. By coincidence, I was talking with Marjorie Queen Croft yesterday, and she told me a story about boxing. That Bruce McQueen and Walt Croft went down to see Jack Dempsey, the great boxer. He was fighting in Ohio someplace. And of course, they had some preliminary fights, and one of the preliminary fighters challenged anybody in the audience to get up and fight with him. And Walt Croft, Bruce, I don't know if they'd been drinking, but they were pretty heavy drinkers. And anyway, Bruce challenged Walt to go up there and fight this guy, and Walt did. Walt was a pretty big, strapping man, and the guy, I guess he got some good licks in on this professional boxer. It was a fun story.
I also have another story I'd like to tell you. I just read about a year ago a biography of Al Capone. I don't know what got me interested in that, but I read that. Then I happened to recall some stories that my husband told me. My husband and his grandfather and father owned the Yider gas station outside of town. I have to get in the rural areas too. And Don would tell me that Al Capone and his men would stop and buy gas from the station. They brought their big cans with them. And relating back to my story, in the story of Al Capone, or the biography, it said that Al Capone had a hideaway in Lansing. And that's what made me recall the story, because Don said that Capone and his men would come by like on a Friday or whatever, drop off these cans and tell them to fill them up, that when they came back through, they would pick up the cans of gas, which they did. And then they always stuck the money in the screen door or the door. And Don said it was always a generous amount. Well, it was probably generous because they made this lightning liquor from it or whatever during the time when they weren't supposed to make liquor, during Prohibition. So my husband was engaged in some illicit business.
Well, thank you all very much for your comments. We enjoyed it very much, and if it's okay with all of you, we'd like to.
Well, thanks, Norm, for doing such a fine job, and all of our distinguished panel up here. We've got many years of experience. I'd also like to thank everyone here for coming tonight. We certainly appreciate it.
The Lowell Area Historical Museum is proud to sponsor community oral history interviews. The Lowell Area Historical Museum educates, enriches, and inspires our community and visitors through the preservation and presentation of Lowell area history. For reservations and more information, contact the Lowell Area Historical Museum at 616-897-7688.